formatting this presentation. For the first half hour of the presentation, Tom and I will be sharing some information with you. And for the second half of the presentation, from 7 to 7:30, we'll answer questions. There are question cards in the back, and we ask that you write your question down. That's serving a couple of purposes. One is we want to be able to answer as many of your questions this evening as possible, and secondly, we want to be able to add those questions to an ongoing Q&A sheet that we have on the website, so that as other members of the community attend some of our other forums, they have additional information based on questions that you've created and you've generated. So this evening, this is, and I'm going to read a statement that we read at the beginning of all of our informational sessions, if you'll bear with me. The purpose of this informational meeting is to provide the public with factual and neutral information regarding Gilbert Unified's bond election and maintenance and operations override election, both scheduled for November 3rd, 2015. The district has made fact sheets available. Those are in the back, but they're also available online, that provide information on the election and is prepared to respond to questions from the public regarding such fact sheets and the election in general. Please understand that Arizona law requires district officials to respond to questions from the public using factual and neutral information only, and district officials, of which there are several of us here as well, in addition to Tom and I presenting, representing election information at district-sponsored information sessions, may not respond to such questions with information designed to influence the outcome of the election. The information this session is not intended to be a debate discussing the pros and cons of either the bond or override election. It's simply to provide factual and neutral election information. So if you ask us to take a position and convince you one way or the other, we're not going to answer that question. But we do want to answer your other questions, factual questions. So let me start by just talking about why the board has voted and approved for us to go out for a maintenance and operations override election. We have approved, the board has approved 10% maintenance and operations override election for this year, and this is in response to a need to replace a sunsetting override election that was approved in 2007 but expired in 2014-15. And so for this fiscal year, 15-16, we do not have an M&O override funds in our budget. The other reason that the board has approved an override election is to, as they have stated, to offer competitive wages for our staff. And we certainly are looking at peer districts to determine those competitive wage levels. We also want to maintain class size at the current level, or to be able to reduce class sizes. That has been an area that's been identified by the board as an area of priority. The board has also indicated that they want to maintain the academic programs that are in place and have gone out to vote, or will go out to vote with these elections, seeking the funds to be able to maintain the operating dollars to do so. The board has also approved to go out for a bond election, and in this situation we have a capital budget override election that was approved in 2007 that also expired at the end of fiscal 2014-15. So we're entering this year a year beyond that override election. During this similar time period, the last 7 to 8 years, the state funding for capital expenditures has also gone down significantly over this time period. So GPS at this point has put in place together an 10-year facilities plan, which began a year ago. And so we have before us $138 million worth of facility-related expenses that will either be addressed through a bond election, if successful, or will be considered as part of our deferred maintenance planning as we move forward. More than half of our students as well have computers that are over 5 years old, and a good number of our staff and students have computers that are over a decade or have reached a decade in terms of time period. And so the governing board has approved going out for a bond election to address that area as well. The last matter that the board has discussed as well in board meetings is our aging bus fleet. And so 1/3 of our buses are over 20 years old. The challenge there is with replacement parts and being able to maintain a fleet that has aged to that point. So recently, we had, up until 2020, GPS has had a successful history of override and bond elections. And you see our history noted behind me. In 2012 and 2013, the board went out for the public's vote to renew or replace the bond and override, or the capital and override election that sunsetted a year ago. And those two elections failed for the public. You can see the amount by which we went out for that override vote. It's important to note, it's important to note where we are currently spending our operating dollars. What you'll see this chart represent that represents fiscal 2014, which is a 2013-14 school year, and it shows data that is published by the Auditor General's office. And it shows that the majority of our funds, 61.2%, are spent for instruction in the classroom. You'll also note that instructional supports, which also go to the classroom, student support, also raise that amount well beyond the 70% level going to students in the classroom. If you consider other things that are student-focused, transportation, food services, are also directed towards direct services to students. And so we have the majority of our funds going towards student support, students' classroom expenditures. We are the highest district in terms of expenditures going towards the classroom when we look at our peers. So if we look comparatively for this particular school year with Chandler, Tucson, Dysart, Deer Valley, Scottsdale, Paradise Valley, Peoria, and Phoenix Union, we spend more in the classroom than all of these districts. We also spend the least amount in administration. If you look at the amount that's noted up there for administration, which is 7.8%, that also includes the administration in school buildings. So if you back out the administration in school buildings, we're spending less than 4% of our district budget for centralized office staff at district office. You'll see here also that classroom spending in the classroom, the largest amount is spent for teachers, aides, and supplies in the classroom. GPS has, as I noted, the highest classroom investment as compared to our peers as well as compared to state average. So when I noted that our override funds expired this past year, and as our budget has decreased over the years, we have continued to dedicate the same percentage on average to the classroom. So that means making cuts in non-classroom expenditure areas.
Thank you. Borrow the clicker. Great. Thank you. Good evening. The chart in front of you depicts the district's maintenance operation, or essentially our district's operational budget going back to the 2008-9 fiscal year. The two components I'd like to point out in the chart is the blue represents the amount of our maintenance and operations budget that is formula driven. In other words, a formula determined by the state, and we'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of what are the components that go into that formula. The orange or red color represent what was approved by the citizens of the Gilbert Public Schools in terms of an override to exceed the state determined formula for their budget. As you can see, For the past these 5 years, it was basically fully funded at the 10% level. Then the past 2 years, it drops by a third each year, leading up to the current school year, where the district's operational budget is only applicable to what is derived from the state's budget formula. So what's being proposed in this fall's election? 2 questions. One is a override, and that's not a term that we determine, that's a statutory term, override, which allows the district to exceed its M&O state developed or state derived budget by 10%. And the second question is to receive authorization to sell and issue bonds totaling $98 million for capital needs, which we'll talk about in a second. And just a reminder, this is a mail-in election, so there's no voting place. This is a mail-in only election. Is a maintenance and operations override different than a bond? The answer is definitely yes. Is that the maintenance and operations override pays for operational expenses, and we listed some of those examples. The primary portion of that being the people aspect, which accounts in excess of about 87 or 88% of the district's budget. The bonds pay for capital expenses, things, buses, buildings, technology, and textbooks are some of the example of capital items which can be paid for by bonds. As you mentioned before, the district's day-to-day or operational budget is our maintenance and operation budgets. And those are some of the things that are funded through that. As I mentioned before, about 88% of this year's M&O budget is dedicated to pay staff costs. How is this budget limit determined by the state? These are the factors that go in. It's a very complex formula. It basically utilizes a weighted student count, a base level of support determined by the state of Arizona, by the legislature, a teacher experience factor, and some transportation factors. So those are the factors that go into determining our districts and other districts in Arizona budget limits. What is an override? It is local control. Basically, it's the citizens of Gilbert Public Schools deciding whether or not to allow the school district to exceed the state formula budget. It supplements the state formula that sets the funding levels. One important note that this override is fully funded through the property taxes, 100% by the property taxes. It provides for a district to go up to 15% over the state determined budget limit. Gilbert Public Schools is requesting only 10%. A number of the area school districts have 15% overrides. This slide shows how much will this override, if passed, generate in terms of dollars for the district's maintenance and operations budget. The first 5 years is estimated to be about $18.6 million per year. And then, as we saw on that last slide, it decreases in 6th year and 7th year by a third, meaning $12.4 million in 2021 and $6.2 million in 22-23.
So there were approved areas by the board when they voted to go out for an override election. There were 5 areas of focus for the M&O, the maintenance and operating budget override. The primary area identified by the board that these funds would be applied towards is to offer competitive wages. And competitiveness, as I mentioned, would be based on a study of our wage scale, our schedule, salary schedule, with salary schedules with peer districts to ensure that we have competitiveness across our salary schedule. The second area of priority identified by the board was to maintain or reduce class size. We look across the district, there are some classes that are full but are still within reasonable amounts, and we're doing well there. We don't want to go above that, but we do have some classes where the kids are packed into classrooms, and we're making determinations as we go through the year as to whether we are adding a teacher in order to reduce that class size load. So that's another area of priority. The third area is we are a district that has been identified by the state as being an A-level district, And the board has identified this as the third area of commitment to ensure that we have the appropriate funds to continue to fund the programs that are offered in our schools. The fourth area of priority is to look at controlling the amount of fees that are being passed to parents to be able to continue to provide the visual and performing arts opportunities, the athletic opportunities, and other co-curricular opportunities that are currently offered in the district. And as funds go down, some of those expenses are shifted to families in the form of fees. So that's a fourth area of priority to control how many fees we're passing on to families. The fifth area of priority identified by the board is to look at the support programs for college and career readiness. We want to ensure that our students are taking full advantage and are fully knowledgeable about and receiving the support services to learn about their career and college options, as well as early college credit opportunities while in high school. So, as I mentioned, from 2008, 2009, which is fiscal 2009, through this year's fiscal 2016, the formula that the state has in place to fund capital improvement, capital expenditures in the district is set by a formula that you'll see in the green. That is the amount of dollars that the district would have received each year. When you look to the far right, the amount received, that shows what we actually received from the state as compared to the formula provided by the state on what we should have received. And you'll see that in 2008, 2009, as the recession started hitting the state, that we had received a little less than what the formula indicated we would receive as a district. But by 2015-16, our current fiscal year, you'll see there's about a $14 million gap between what we should be receiving from the state and what we're actually receiving from the state. And as you heard Tom talk about earlier, those capital expenditures that we have for maintenance of facilities and buses and so forth are areas that are impacted by these funds. And you'll see that the 8-year cumulative impact on the district, we received in 8 years $72 million less than what the state formula indicated we should be receiving.
This slide depicts or shows the district's capital funding for that same time period beginning in 2008-2009 through this year. The blue represents what you just saw on that graph in terms of what the district received as through the formula, the reduced formula. And the orange or red represents the two capital overrides, one from 2005 and one 2007, that were approved by the citizens of Gilbert Public Schools. As you can see, this school year, as Dr. Kishimoto talked about, is the override expired last year, so we're living off of what the state has provided through the reduced formula. Right now we're about $2.7 million. If you looked at the district's capital budget for this year, it's slightly higher, it's a little over $5 million. There were some carryover, carry forward funds that were utilized. Those will not be available after this year. We intend on expending that full amount of the $5 million capital budget's been expended. So we can, unless there's a huge infusion of dollars, we can expect pretty much to live off of this over the next few years.
So the bond election that the board has approved for us to pursue and bring to the public is a bond for $98 million, and these would be issued, these are bonds that are issued over a 7-year period. There are 4 areas that were predefined by the board and were submitted as part of our pamphlet in terms of how these bonds would be used. So we would have to spend in these areas, so those are predefined areas. Facilities maintenance, $40 million to continue to maintain our buildings. And I shared an amount earlier that shows that this really represents only a portion of what we need for facilities maintenance. But it will help us to continue to maintain our 41 school buildings plus non-school facilities and over 5 million square feet of space that we maintain in this district. Technology, $35 million to continue to do refreshes for computers and support that work for students and teachers. Student transportation, the buses, $15 million directed towards that. School construction land purchases at $8 million, and that's for a total of $98 million. We can potentially go out for more than twice this amount of bonding. The board in conversation talked about what was a reasonable amount to go out for bonds in terms of impact on taxpayers over the next potential impact on taxpayers over the next 7 years. So facilities impact, as I mentioned, we had a 10-year facilities plan that was presented to the board a year ago. There are 9 years left on that plan. It's very specific on the areas in which we would be using these dollars: safety, security, HVAC, energy conservation, asphalt, which is the paving for the parking lots, roofing, and finishes for flooring and repairs. So this is basic maintenance of our facilities, as you can see. As I mentioned, the $40 million that the board has approved to target towards building facilities out of these bond dollars represent only approximately 1/3 of what is actually detailed in the rest of that 9-year plan. The other area is technology at $35 million. The technology dollars would help us to ensure that our students have access to computers, and that we have a plan to refresh our computers for both teachers and students. We have aging computers that are beyond their lifetime, as I mentioned, that are 5 years up to 10 years and beyond in our classrooms and in our offices. The other is teacher development related to these computers, the provision of a curriculum platform for teachers to develop curriculum together and share those curriculums across schools, ensuring that we continue to address our wired and wireless network capacity, so that work can happen, students can be on computers simultaneously in schools without having them be blocked out. We also are looking to maintain our online instruction distance learning, and of course ensuring that we continue to look at data security and disaster recovery in terms of our information systems. Sorry, this is sticking today. Transportation is critical. The bond would allow us to replace 98 school buses. That still represents only 60% of our total fleet, but would have a tremendous impact. Out of the 162 buses, when we look at buses that are 20 years old and older. The bus replacement would happen over 7 years. You have a schedule there of when those will occur, and the bonding for this would occur simultaneously with when those purchases would occur. So we would not bond ahead of time for this. This puts us on a bus replacement cycle of 20 years or 250,000 miles. That actually pushes us to the limit of typical bus replacement.
There we go. Thank you. Now I'd like to focus for the next few minutes just on ultimately what is the net cost to our taxpayers for these two questions, both the maintenance and operations override as well as the bonds. Our average limited value, or average property value in Gilbert Public Schools, this is a number that we get from Maricopa County, so it's not a number that we're making up, is $170,000. For property tax purposes, for residential property, 10% of that's utilized for tax calculation purposes. Now, if we break down the two questions, first the maintenance and operations override, the tax impact of that would be $1.10 for $100 of limited assessed valuation, and then we provide for you what the tax impact would be per year, per month, or per day of the maintenance and operations override. On the bonds, it's a little more complex. By statute, we're required to show is what is the average impact of these proposed bonds over the life of the bonds. The bonds will be amortized over 15 years, although the technology bonds will be only amortized over 5 years. So the $40 million, which will be issued in multiple phases, those will have a 5-year term. But we're representing the average cost over the 15-year life cycle of all the bonds at 49 cents per $100 of value. Subsequently then, what is the annual impact, monthly impact, and daily impact of that? One note we'd like to make is that the estimated tax impact, and this will be described in more detail in the voter informational pamphlets, which if you haven't received, it should be being mailed out over the next several weeks. The actual estimated tax impact for the first year will be 11 cents, it will be 49, which represents the average tax impact over the life of the bond. We'd like to drill in now a little more specifically related to the tax rate impact. And again, this is the secondary tax rate, so what's being voted on will have an impact not on the district's primary rate, but the district's secondary tax rate for bonds and overrides. This chart shows the secondary tax rate for our school district going back to 2012-13 fiscal year. It was $3.11, and it was comprised of 3 components. The blue being the principal and interest payments for bonds that have been approved by our citizens. The red represents the capital override or overrides that were approved both in 2005 and 2007. And the yellow represents the M&O override that was passed in 2007. So it breaks it down by the 3 components, that $3.11 tax rate by the 3 components. So then you can see as the M&O override began to scale down by 1/3 and 1/3, the amount dropped for that, as well as the capital override, as that began to phase out, dropped in tax impact. And as the district paid off existing debt, the bond tax rate also fell off to these particular corresponding rates. So our secondary tax rate dropped from $3.11 to $2.02 last year. This year, it's solely payment for the bonds because the M&O override and the capital override expired, so there's no tax impact on this year's tax bill for either of those two components. So let's look at next year what the potential tax impact would be. As we saw on that slide before, the $1.10 is the tax rate for the maintenance and operations override component. And then there's the bond component. And the reason there's a range here is that even with the additional debt, because we're paying off debt at the same time, our rate is dropping. So we're representing that in a range of $1.04 to $1.14 because the board also approved $2.4 million for defeasance of debt. So depending on how we structure that defeasance, our tax rate for our bonds, both existing and new, could be as low as $1.14 or high, low of $1.04 to a high of $1.14. So that's why you see a range of rates here, 214 to 224. So I think it's important to note too is that I think comparing this year, this current year is not a good comparison to what next year will look like because the overrides had dropped off or had expired. So looking at the rates, is next year's projected rate is very similar to what it was last year, but less than it was 2 previous years going backwards. Now let's switch from rates to tax impact real quickly. This is based on an average taxable home values. Now rather than looking at rates, we're actually looking at tax impact. So for that that average home value back in 2013 is that their secondary taxes were $478, and it broke it down in those 3 components. So you see that for 2012-13, 13-14, and 14-15. This current school year or fiscal year, all we have is the bonds. And so for that average value home in Gilbert, which this year is about $170,000, the secondary tax impact is about $202 for that. We look ahead, if both of the questions are passed, The tax impact of the M&O override would range from $187 to $196. And one could ask, why is there a range for that? Depends on how much your home would grow in value. $187 would be the impact if the average home remained at $170,000. If it increased at 5%, which is now the new limit, it can't increase value. Your limited property value cannot increase any more than 5% for tax purposes beginning this year. The maximum tax impact of that M&O override question would be the $196. Same thing for the bond. Would range from $177 to the $202. Two factors go into why there's a range there. One is that rate we talked about before, the $1.04 or $1.14, depending on how we structure our defeasance. And secondly is if the average residential home increased either 0 or 5 or the maximum 5%. So we wanted to represent. So ultimately, for the owner of that $170,000 home, the tax impact of both questions could range from that $364 to $399, depending on what the growth of your residential home was. As you can see, that $399 rate, we'll pick the high one, is the same as it was back in the 2013-14 fiscal year.
So as we move towards election day, there's a couple of sessions that we're providing at different high schools, informational sessions for the public and the community. It's open to anyone. October 5th is an important date for this community. It's a deadline for voter registration. It's for new registrants in terms of voter registration. For members of the community who are already registered voters, you would receive a pamphlet of information and a ballot in your mailbox automatically. And so no actions to be taken to do that. But for new registrants, the deadline is October 5th in order to participate in this upcoming election. October 30th is the last day to mark and mail a ballot. And the ballot that's mailed. This is an all mail-in ballot. In Maricopa County, though, up until Election Day, which is November 3rd, you can actually walk in your ballot to any polling place from another area in Maricopa County. But here, we are doing all mail-in ballot, and that closes or is due postmark October 30th. So with that, we'd like to know if you have questions for us, and I think we have them on cards. Okay, so I'm going to start some of these questions, and if we don't get to them, we will put the response online, so we'll get those in within a few days' time to make sure we get to all of them. Although looks like we only have a few. So there's a couple of questions we received here. Must people who submit pro or con statements live in the district?
I'm not sure if that's a requirement or not.
It's not a requirement.
I don't think there is actually a residency that's checked when we were working with the county attorney's office.
If you haven't received your voter informational pamphlet, it still might be early yet. They are posted on the Maricopa County Educational Service Agency's website. So if you want to get one early, you can go out there and there's a web link on their website. So it's Maricopa County Educational Services Agency under their elections tab. And you can get a copy of this, but all registered voters should be receiving a copy of this over the next couple of weeks.
So the next question is who vets where people live who submit. We can ask the county attorney's office if there is any vetting. My understanding is there is no vetting of residency. But we can officially ask the question and post that response online. Two of the people who submitted arguments also submitted the same statement in another district. This is a question of statement, but I'll read it. Is that legal? Two of the submissions came from Mera, I think is what's written in here, M-E,
North Mason.
oh, North Mesa, okay, and South Queen Creek. There is nothing that keeps someone from submitting to different district elections, is my understanding as well. What the guidelines are for who can submit is something that we can also post on our website. That set of questions. How are increased wages for teachers continued once the override term is over? So the historically in Gilbert, and many, and most districts will say similarly, the override elections is something that the district has counted on because it has historically passed. The last two elections in 2012 and 13 did not pass, which meant that our funding decreased, and then eventually this year we didn't have those additional funds. Which means that as we need to adjust for competitive wages, if there are no override funds, then the board will need to look at its existing budget and consider what kind of actions they need to take to ensure that they continue to provide competitive wages, and if they can do that within the existing budget, which means that other areas, and I showed you a chart of other areas that we fund, facilities, student resources, buses, transportations, all of those other areas will need to be looked at, and there will be an impact on some area in order to keep adjusting wages so that they are competitive. But the fact is that the board has to annually pass a balanced budget with the existing funds that they have. Is there a minimum percent of registered voters that have to vote for bonds and override to pass? No, it's whoever's registered to vote. This is a majority election. There is no minimum of voters that have to vote for the elections to pass. What is your expectation of the future trend in state funding for the school district? My personal expectation. So what I'll answer is if you look at all of the conversations happening throughout the state, whether it's the governor or legislative leaders or leaders of various professional organizations representing education, there are lots of ongoing conversations about funding for education, particularly in the state, but certainly throughout the nation. And so that's something that we'll continue to look at. That is an important conversation for the board and I to continue to talk about on an annual basis as we're looking at how do we maintain those priorities that the board set. And one of those priorities is maintaining our A-level district status with existing programming that comes at a certain budget cost. And so if we don't have override funds or the state decreases funds, one of the things that's important for the board and I to do is to be part of the legislative discussion. And that's something that the board has also, in this last meeting, talked about its legislative agenda to be actively involved in those statewide discussions. And it says thanks. Thank you. Okay, the override is approved. Will teacher stipends be returned? And would it be effective retroactively this year? Okay, so there's no returning of stipends or funds. There is a looking at what our salary schedule, that's the work that's happening now. So how do we create a competitive salary schedule, and within the context of a competitive salary schedule for teachers, look at whether stipends are needed, in which places they're needed, and how we're using stipends. So over the last 5 to 7 years, we've made as a district adjustments to stipends in place of salary increases in many ways to get the work done. The fact is that you can't run a competitive salary schedule by making these periodic adjustments just to stipends for some staff. We've got to adjust the salary schedule overall. So there'll be an adjustment to salary schedules that the board will be considering, and then there'll be a conversation about how we utilize stipends well in this district for that extra work, extra pay for extra work in particular areas that we need to have additional work done in. Okay, if the the override passes, GPS has stated they want to offer teachers competitive raises. What will GPS teachers need to do to receive an increase in pay? So the actual components of what goes into a salary schedule, we are looking at a stepless salary schedule, which allows teachers to be paid, and actually all staff to be paid within a range based on experience, based on the work that they are hired for, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's a non-teaching position. Those salary schedules will go before the board, and the conversation about what goes into that salary schedule is what the teacher salary committee is reviewing right now. So that's part of the work that we've done this year. It'll be done by looking at other districts as well in terms of how they have their salary schedules structured. We want to be competitive. This is an area when you talk about salaries, if you don't want to be uncommon, you want to be common with like districts, and we want to be able to attract and retain top talent here. The last 2 years, as I presented to the board, and the board has discussed in public as well, we've had a decrease, an increase in the number of both certified and non-certified staff who have left the district at a rate higher than we typically have seen in the Gilbert Public Schools. And part of that, and that's not the whole story, but certainly part of that would, teachers or staff have cited competitive salary is one of the reasons they're leaving. So we know we need to have a competitive salary schedule in order to retain our talent here. Okay, those are the questions asked. Anyone else have a card? And as I mentioned, we're doing it in writing so that we can post responses on the website for others to see as well. Appropriate wait time? Okay, thank you. We will be here, Tom and I, any other staff members officially working this evening? Okay, so we have a couple of the hands who are available from, Stan, did you raise your hand? Okay, so we have from facilities, from technology, from finance, so from a couple of areas, special ed, curriculum. If you have questions related to these particular areas, we're all available to answer your questions. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.